Well, hi. First of all, I want to say welcome to everyone out in the web, and we are delighted to host this webinar for collegiate flute teaching during the COVID-19 crisis. So what I want to help everyone with, especially with some illustrious colleagues, is to kind of understand where we are, how we can mitigate the circumstances, not merely with the way that we can perform and the way that we can teach, but then also what are the outcomes and the measurements, because that's kind of the issues at hand for many of us, is how do we mitigate and still be as effective as possible. So first of all, I want to share with everyone the panelists that we have. Right now we have Catherine Kemmler, who is the Charles and Mary Barre Alumni Professor of Music at LSU. Dr. Ronna Maines, who's Professor of Music and Department Chair at the University of Arkansas. She also is on the NASM, or has served on the NASM Committee on Ethics. And then Susan Milan will be joining us. She's teaches at the Royal College of Music London, Trinity Laban Conservatory in London, and the Royal Northern College of Music. And we'll also be joined a little bit later on by Mary Karen Clardy from the University of North Texas, and Leonard Garrison, who also is past president of the NFA. Oh, there's Leonard. There he is. Hey, Leonard, how are you doing?
Great.
Hey, well, fantastic. Well, I would like to just kind of get started with the basics of what we have moving forward. And for those who don't know me, I'm Brian Luce. I teach here at the University of Arizona. We're hosting the webinar series because we're also the home of the National Flute Association Library. So it goes hand in hand for us to talk about pedagogies and things that can work forward. So what I'd like to do is start off, and in no particular order, just to kind of go through and look at what we're all having to do when it comes to this physical proximity infection mitigation, which is the more scientific appropriate term for social distancing. I still like to be socially connected, even though it's through a two-dimensional screen. So I'm just going to go ahead and start off with Penny, if you don't mind. Tell me what things have been like for you.
Well, around Friday the 13th of March, LSU decided suddenly to shut down, and we were going to have our spring break a week after that, but we got an extra week off just to help, because we knew that after our spring break we were going to start teaching all of our courses remotely. And so we got a week to kind of get everything in order. So I've been teaching all of my lessons remotely using Zoom, and mostly Zoom. That LSU got Zoom for everybody, so we don't have to pay for it. So I've been teaching all my students with Zoom mostly, and sometimes with FaceTime if Zoom doesn't work. And I had taught with Skype before, but had not been very pleased with it. So that's what we're doing. We're also having to make, as I see you have topics coming up, but we're going to, we've had to make changes in what we're going to do for juries and recitals and things like that too.
Right. So, my apologies, I failed to introduce a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Diane Schultz, who is also another U of A teacher. There's three of us who are here today. And she's been the NFA competitions coordinator, had been for many, many years. What are and you just went through, because of Mother Nature, one of these things that we have to take into account, which is going to be weather. It's going to be connectivity issues. So tell us the things that you've gone through.
We had a similar situation to what Penny Kemmler said about LSU. Same timeline. Spring break approached by Friday the 13th of March. We knew we had a spring break, an extra week. We got Zoom and other platforms as well for the university, but for applied teaching, we went to Zoom instruction, which we've done for 2 weeks now. Last night, we had a huge storm system came through. It hit a great deal of the southeast, and in our particular area, there were a lot of power outages, internet outages that reminded us of the tornado we had in 2011, which was the first time that we were asked about teaching by some non-traditional, not the typical face-to-face methods. So today has been a bit interesting, wondering if I would even be able to be on the webinar, but certainly connectivity is an issue with students. We all have students, depending on where they went once their physical campus closed. We've definitely had some things where we've had to get creative about the teaching, sometimes by telephone, sometimes FaceTime. I even did one early meeting by WhatsApp audio call, and it worked. So it worked, but we had some students just getting them from point A to point B. But happily, I think everything's coming back on board in town. But it is definitely an issue when there is no power or internet. What do you do? I don't have the answer, but it's an issue to consider, of course.
Right. Absolutely. Leonard, what have things been like up? You still have a pretty good amount of winter taking place up in your neck of the woods. Has it affected and changed things for your teaching and your transmission?
You're talking to me? You cut
Yes.
out a little bit. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. We actually had hopefully our last freeze this weekend, and it is a nice sunny day. So, yeah, it's similar to what everybody else is saying. And I'm actually going to experiment this week with kind of a hybrid method of instruction. I feel it's really important to keep as much as possible a sense of normalcy in these times. So we're having our weekly studio class as well as the weekly lessons. And so in the studio class, I ask my students, do you have any suggestions about how things are going? How's it going for you? How are your other classes? And they all hate Zoom. They're more frustrated than I am. So what we're going to try this week is the night before each of their lessons, they're going to record their material and send it to me, and I'm going to review it, and then we're going to use their lesson as more of an interactive time. But that way, I'll have a good idea of what they really sound like. And I told them, don't take any extra time to make it a good recording. Just wherever you are and you're practicing, just put it down, send it to me. I don't want you to spend any extra effort. But some of them have told me they're taking other lessons on other instruments, piano, and some of their teachers are not even dealing with Zoom, that they're having to send in a recording of their material and then the teacher give them comments, and they don't like that because it doesn't have the interactive bit of lessons. So that's where we are, and we've had to change coming up here, juries, recitals, and competitions. We're working for their juries, and they're all going to make video recordings of their juries and upload for the Woodwind area to review. For their recitals, the same thing. They're going to make videos of each piece, upload it on the School of Music Facebook page, because the NASM requirement is those recitals have to be public. And so that's the way to make it public. So I'm helping them get through that.
Right. That's a really difficult mitigation sort of accommodation that has to be had. So since we have someone who's intimately connected with NASM, Rhonda, it would be great to hear sort of how, at least from what your connections and what your communications are with our accrediting agency, how we're dealing with those things. I mean, what are the best practices?
That's a great question. And I don't think any of us have the absolute answer, because we're all in this together and we're all learning as we go. The commission has voted not to meet this spring, and because it is still not safe. And so those institutions which have submitted proposals for plan approval will wait until November, when we will meet and discuss all of those at that point. I'm encouraging my faculty to be as flexible as possible with all students, because the stress level for students is as great or greater than it is for us. We have students that have gone home and have 6 siblings at home and find it hard to take their lessons. And so some of the recordings that they send in are interesting, to say the least. And so we're taking this one day at a time. And Leonard's right, the performance is supposed to be public, but we haven't defined exactly what that is. And there is a feature that on some streaming platforms, literature can be taken down pretty quickly.
Uh-oh, Brian, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muting myself because I knew there was some background noise. I wanted to now speak and have Susan give us a little bit of her perspective from across the pond, because dealing with students in the conservatory system, which is, you have different accrediting bodies and different methods and different things that you have to meet. So what have you found so far in your teaching and the things that have to be sort of accommodated?
Yes, well, I'm probably a little bit behind the curve as far as that goes compared to you. You all sound incredibly high tech over there. I've given some lessons on Zoom, and as all of you are probably saying, there are lots of complications. There's the sound, the tone, a little bit difficult to see what they're doing. Some students don't seem to be very organized. I taught a student the other day, and I was looking up at her embouchure for the entire lesson, which was actually quite an interesting thing to be doing. It gave me a whole new perspective on how she was making her sound. But the sound kept cutting out after a certain level and after a certain pitch, and literally cutting right out, so that it was as if she was muted. And that was very complicated. But I dare say we will overcome these things with better microphones and getting to know Zoom a little bit better, because I'm in my early stages of learning what to do on this. As far as the conservatories go, which is what you were really asking, I teach in 3 conservatories. They've all taken on Zoom. They're all offering Zoom as a platform for all their professors for every single kind of class. And they've decided, I think unanimously, to defer the live end of year recital exams, what we call, do you call it jury? What do you call it over there? Juries?
Juries.
Yes. Well, for us, it's just the end of year recital exams, their final degree recital exams. And they've deferred those until September, basically, or maybe even later. Because I think they feel that it's better to wait and allow them to give a live recital in front of a live audience. So that's what's happening with that.
Right.
So,
well, and yes, go ahead, Penny.
I just wanted to say something about the Zoom situation that, because Susan alluded to the sound cutting off and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
One of my colleagues sent me a list of things that you're supposed to do with Zoom. I don't know how many of the rest of you have this list, but you go to, you have to click on settings, and then you have to go to audio, and then you have to make sure that this little slot that says automatically adjust microphone volume is unchecked.
Yeah.
And then from there you go to advanced, and then from there you have to disable both background noise filters, and then you have to check enable original sound. And then, so I found that made a huge difference right
Really?
there.
Yeah.
But
can I ask you though,
yeah.
The thing is that if the student doesn't do that, and they have a poor computer and they don't have an individual microphone,
yeah.
is that really going to make a big difference? I mean, if I were playing into my computer and I did all that stuff, then maybe, I'd sound like me, maybe. But if they are doing it, if they're not doing it, is it going to make a big difference to that lesson?
Okay, so what I have found I have to do sometimes is take them through step by step. Go to this screen. Can you see the thing that looks like a little flower? Click on that and do this. And but even so, even when, but when they do all those things, usually it's okay, but it depends, other things too. Are they close enough to the router? Are there other family members sharing their Wi-Fi because maybe they're at home where parents are working remotely? So so a lot of what I've kind of come down to is what Leonard's talking about with having them record their materials and send to me. But instead of my listening to them ahead of time, I tend to listen to it with them through. You can share the screen on Zoom as Brian is doing with us with his slides here, and listen to it together and talk about it, and then go from there. But I do, I did have a student who had done all the things I'd asked her to do, but she had other people sharing her Wi-Fi, and it didn't even sound like a flute. It sounded like R2-D2 from Star Wars. So that's why I've kind of decided that we're going to try this
Yes.
recording thing.
Right. So the issues we're going through is, the methods of teleinstruction, at least as our university has dubbed this, where you're either teaching synchronously, which would be what we're doing right now, which is really dependent so much on connectivity. It's been on bandwidth. It's on the load of the router. It is on the processor. I mean, not all of our students have the latest, greatest processor. None of us do either, that will allow the machine to work. For me right now, I'm actually using an outboard audio interface, which is going through microphones. It's the recording rig that I use in essence in my studio all the time, and it has artificial reverberation, and I can eliminate the compressors and things like that are on phones. Most of the students are actually watching us through their phone on a very, that's why if you're seeing nose hairs, they're looking down at their phone, which a phone is designed, even if it has two microphones, it's designed to noise cancel. It has a phase cancellation algorithm, which will in essence turn off all of those upper frequencies. All the world that we live in is gone completely. The one thing that I've found with my students, if we're going to do asynchronous instruction, I'll have them record their etudes or their orchestral excerpts, but I tell them, take your phone, put it about 12 feet away, set it on a pillow, because it'll absorb sound. There's no reflections. I mean, the wavelength of flute hiss is like that long, and if it repeats itself next to a hard surface, you're going to get so much of that upper frequency noise, which makes them sound always agitated or angry, or their vibrato's really, really over the top. So it's all of these really interesting little workarounds. Leonard is using probably one of the simplest solutions, which is to cancel the noise by having headphones. So far, Leonard, how have the headphones worked, at least in like your synchronous teaching? You talked about teaching asynchronously by having them upload recordings.
Well, these are lighter headphones, so I can hear sound in the room as well as sound through the internet, and so it works pretty well. I can pick up my flute and demonstrate, and I'm hearing that, and then I hear the student and so on. I'm facing a particular problem, which I know several of the rest of you also are, that I have some really good, really advanced students. They're just as good as any students anywhere. I'm really proud of them. And then I have some students from rural backgrounds with not much background and, not many resources. And, they're at home and they're on really crappy internet and they're on their phone. They can't afford a laptop. And so I just have to accept that. So that's, it's as Bernie Sanders was saying, that this really brings out the inequalities in our nation, and I see it through how the students are using what access they have to different resources.
Difficult. You've gone again, Brian.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate that. The one thing, part and parcel of what I do with my students, not only in the studio, but outside the studio, is we're always in our recording studio. So they're used to using a pair of these nasty things, which are around the ear, big, huge headphones, which I'll use sometimes during synchronous teaching, because then again, there's no bleed. You don't have, because a Zoom, or it could be Adobe Connect, it could be Skype, it could be WebEx. There's always a noise canceller that turns off as soon as I start to play or someone else does. It's an anti-interruption feature in essence. So that's probably one of the simplest ones. My students usually wear their earbuds, which of course the problem with earbuds is they have bone conduction, so they never hear what they sound like, even though they can sort of hear in real time. It's just that if you have compression around the pinna of the ear, then you can't really hear well, as we all know. So there's interesting little problems, and again, connectivity, like you say, Leonard. I know for my students, and I'm not sure how many of you have had this offered by your institution, but I know that a lot of companies are offering trial versions of their software for an extended period of time. So my students, we've all started to use Digital Performer, that's what we use in our recording studio. It's an industry standard DAW, and it will actually take a computer, and you can set it to record through the computer, but it will turn off a lot of those mitigating compressors and things like that, so you get more of a raw sound. Even with maybe not the latest, newest computer, there's some things you have to get into it, but since my students have always used digital audio workstations for their own projects and things like that, now they just have it available to them. And there's lots of interesting little strategies and things like that I think that move forward. So I kind of wanted to ask, so Susan, you said that, so if things are canceled for the term, and since you have a summer class, I think part of the issue that we face, as we talked about with connectivity and tools, is the professional goals. I mean, most of our students are used to be very goal-oriented. They have a competition, and now that competitions have been ceased and summer workshops and that, what do you find with your students? I mean, how have you helped mitigate that and give them those goals that they are so used to having on their own?
Has your term started now? Because our term doesn't start officially for another week.
We're on a semester system here at the U of A, so we've been going since January.
Oh, right. Well, we're on Easter break now, and we start in about a week's time, officially. But I have been teaching some of my students, and I'm being in constant touch with them as well, to try and just work out some way of keeping them from drifting, and from feeling kind of neglected, really. And that's where I think the one-to-one teaching, I think recording and sending recordings in is a very interesting idea, and I'll certainly be considering that. But for me, I'm very much a one-to-one teacher, and I like the spontaneity, even if the sound is not so good. I like to see what they're doing. I like to be able to see the physiology of what they're doing, and to be able to respond to them immediately. So I'll probably go along the Zoom route, just direct, and put up with the bad sound when it happens, or try to improve it. But I've decided to try to run a weekly class, which I always do anyway at the conservatories where I teach. I run a scale and study class because I feel it keeps them on their toes. And if I can do the split screen class every week with my students, I think that will help, because they'll see each other and we'll have a slightly more normal room feel, I suppose. And then the one-to-one lessons will be much as they are. And to keep them motivated, is that what we're talking about, keeping them motivated and on track. It's very hard, isn't it? I have a student in Manchester, for example. She is actually a Chinese student from Wuhan, and she wasn't able to go home because she couldn't get a flight, and it was terribly expensive, and no one was flying anywhere anyway. And so she's in her room day in, day out, with nobody to talk to most of the time, and trying to motivate herself and practice. So for me, one of the big difficulties, one of the things we've all got to overcome, is keeping them interested and motivated, and to teach them to kind of be self-motivated. And I think there are lots of different ways we can do that. We can, first of all, try to encourage them to take this opportunity of having so much time to actually listen more to music, and not flute players, but listen to music, listen to singers, listen to great violinists, listen to great pianists, so that broaden their knowledge of what great artists sound like, and so they can get more into themselves, into their heads more, without, they're not constantly outside of themselves looking in, which is such a thing today, isn't it, with selfies. They're all worried about what they sound like, what they look like to other people. And in fact, just trying to get to the bottom, get to some of the really important issues that they're going to face professionally, and give them a structure. So I try to get them to play a study, of course, every week. They always do anyway. But now, not just to play a study, but to memorize a study, because this is quite hard for some of them. But if they can do that, they'll have a sense of achievement, and that's what's going to be difficult, giving them a sense of achievement when, as you say, they haven't got competitions, they haven't got exams, regular feedback from classes and master classes, which we have at all of the conservatories now. They're very much on their own, and they're going to have to, it's going to be difficult. It's a sort of growing process, isn't it? How do you all feel about that?
Well, I wanted to say something, just to share something. I think,
Yeah.
Thank you. We were going to be having our Louisiana Flute Society Flute Festival on the weekend of April 4th and 5th, and we were having Peter Verhoeven was supposed to be coming from Belgium, the wonderful piccoloist. And so in addition to the competitions for that, I was going to have the day after the festival, I was going to have a mock orchestral piccolo audition, or orchestral audition with Peter behind the screen. And that was going to be followed by a master class where he was going to talk to everyone and have people play and so on. And so this was a great disappointment that this all had to be canceled. So what I did was to salvage this, since the students had all, I had 15 students playing piccolos, and they'd all learned, at least these 6 big excerpts. So I asked my colleague Patty Adams from the New Orleans Orchestra, from the LPO, Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra, if we could do a virtual mock piccolo audition. So I made my students, I told them, we'd been working on these so much. So I had them all I said, on your phones, you're going to record yourself all of these 6 excerpts in one go, and you're going to send those to me, and then I anonymously sent those to Patty, and Patty has listened to them, and she's writing individual comments to each student plus an overall ranking. In addition to that, I've numbered them and sent them their own recordings of everybody without knowing who they are. Some of them won't even recognize themselves, maybe, I don't know. Sometimes, and then they're going to rank them, and they're going to make comments. So I think it was a way that I found to kind of salvage this, at least this one particular situation where they were all so disappointed and had already put a lot of work in towards that. And they're all excited about it. And so I think that's a good thing.
Well, I think it's great. I think in some ways it's a big opportunity to learn new skills and to be creative in this way. I think it's fantastic to be able to see all of you and talk to you and discuss our students and what we're going to do with them. I think it's an absolutely wonderful opportunity. But at the same time, in some funny sort of reverse way or totally different way, it's an opportunity for those students to find themselves on their own. They rely so much on, they rely on being taken along a road all the time, and often they're not used to being self-motivated or maybe having resolve. Resolve is an interesting thing, and sometimes they don't have that resolve. And that sort of, how can I put it, that drive on their own to just practice for 6 hours and know that they've improved. They have to be, they need to be sort of helped along all the time. So maybe it's a great opportunity for them, with a lot of encouragement from us, to find their goals and head towards those goals without external help. They have to find their own feet, because my goodness, they're certainly going to have to when they go in the profession, Do you know what I mean? I mean, I'm not being harsh, but I think it's like self-isolation. They can meditate, they can sit and think about music, they can listen to other music, they can concentrate on their sound, they can get inside their heads without so many distractions. I'm finding that myself. I don't have any distractions. You know, it's unbelievable. I don't have a timetable. I'm not running up to London or getting on the train to Manchester. I have all this time. It's fantastic. You have time to think, and maybe some good will come out of it for those students in that respect.
I will be curious to see here at the University of Alabama, a lot of schools in our area, you might be in the similar ones in Arkansas and Louisiana. We have 2 more weeks of regular classes, then we have exam week. Everything will be finished by May 5. I'm curious to see what happens after that. I had a student who was supposed to go to Susan's class this summer in Britain, one who was supposed to go to class in Italy, some who had auditions for jobs, everything's postponed. That will be, I think, that they've all figured out how to do all of their classes in a variety of formats. Some are Zoom, some are synchronous, some are asynchronous. They're using a variety of tools. They all say they have more work, but I think it'll be interesting to see what happens next. A lot of them, maybe they had a part-time job they don't have anymore. They don't have their opportunities to travel or perform or go to master classes they had planned. So I think that's when for me, I wonder what happens after May the 5, including those high school students who had their end of their senior years of high school taken away, and they're looking forward to college, but it's a real gray area. So that's something I wonder about.
I guess that's a great question, actually, maybe even for Rhonda. I mean, because we're talking about matriculating the class of 2020 now, and I'm sure you're dealing with larger issues. I know for me now, taking over assistant director responsibilities, I'm in charge of recruiting. So it's changed a lot of that dynamic. And of course, we've pushed deadlines back, you know, further than they've normally been. So what do you see that, not just in Flute, but in all of our music students?
Well, actually, we've seen an increase in the last 3 weeks in in-state students whose parents probably have a big influence in wanting to keep their students home or at least closer to home. And so we're seeing more applications from in-state students. We're seeing more students interested in studying music, but on a little wider scale than before. A lot of students interested in BA programs. And so it's changing.
Leonard, of your mid-course and your recruiting cycle as well, what's it like in your neck of the country?
Frankly, it's not great for us. We have this disadvantage of being fairly remote school, you know, and so I think the idea that was said before, that parents are keeping their children close to home, really hurts us, because one of our big markets is the Seattle area. And that's 5 hours away. Another big market is Boise, and so, you know, they're choosing just stay at home. So that particular thing really hurts us. In addition, we had to cancel our summer camp, and I know that has happened everywhere, you know, so that's not unusual. I'm in charge of we have an event on campus where the incoming students come, they choose their housing plan, they choose their meal plan, and we get them registered all in one day, and then they're all set. So this was canceled, and I'm in charge of getting those students registered, and it's horrible. It's I tried texting them. 1 or 2 answered. That's supposed to be the best way to contact this generation. Then I tried calling them. They don't answer their phone, so you leave a voicemail. You don't hear back. I tried emailing them. Out of like 16 in the initial, I've got maybe 3 registered by this point. So it's a really good question. What's going to happen for these incoming students?
Well, I think it's interesting because for us, sort of like Rhonda was saying, we actually have had an uptick and not a huge one, but it's different because we rarely ever have a change of students looking at our program after April 1, but we've actually had an uptick in BAs, actually in BMs as well. We haven't seen it in the music education side as much, but you know, I always think about these great brain drain situations that happen throughout history. And, you know, I think, like you were saying, Susan, it's going to be those with fortitude who stick it out, you know, who have that ego that says, you know, I think I have something really important to offer. And probably for us offering, you know, not merely the training, but then the curriculum and the broad-based sort of thing that goes into it. For me, I've always taught, because I wanted to write motion picture soundtracks, I learned those skills a long time ago, and I've implemented it. My students right now are going through their digital audio workstation, and they're making the virtual orchestras for their excerpts. That's their responsibility. They have to make a little bit before and a little bit afterward. And then since a lot of companies have given out their virtual instruments for free for 90 days, they're learning how to use those skills, but then also manipulating. I mean, it's not canned because they actually changed the click tracks. They put in tap to tempos. It's a lot of really fine-grained minutia that they go through. But the interesting thing about this generation of student, by just showing them how to move a note around or to make a tenuto, it means so much more to them. Like Susan and I were chatting this morning, I was working with the student and I shoved the flute this way and I said, well, if you do this with your hands and that, and they said, oh, I'd never seen that. Now, for at least me, and I dare say maybe my generation or a little bit more, if your teacher was in the lesson and they were showing you something, you'd probably look around and see what they were doing and you'd get right in there. But I realized most of my students don't. They just expect it to be there. But by me moving the flute right at the camera, they said, oh, I can see it. I mean, they're so accustomed to seeing two-dimensionality. So I've gotten to this point where I'll let them, they might play synchronously. I'll take a screenshot, and then you can use the notation software that's inherent in Zoom, and you can draw angles and all sorts of things, and they go, oh, I hadn't seen that before. Well, that's okay. You know, it's a really interesting thing. I mean, we've had so many, now the generation, they grew up with these things. They've been staring at them for so long that this is an interesting opportunity as far as pedagogy, I think, to kind of look at how we deliver these sorts of things. So, is anyone else using like smart music or many things like that for the students to add to their repertoire performance? Rhonda, you're nodding your head. Is that like something for your unit you're trying to get accomplished?
Well, we have an institutional site license for smart music, and so we've had several computers set up for a long time, and students are accustomed to using it. And I think all of my students, or the majority of flute students, have now purchased their own subscription, and so they're kind of enjoying that experience. It's more interesting than practicing with a metronome for them.
Right. Well, I know years ago someone there's another colleague who had mentioned that they had been building their smart music library, and I said, well, how do you do that? And I said, well, you actually, if you go into Finale, put in every note for sonatine, for instance, you can convert it into an SMP file, and the students can play there afterwards. So I've actually been collecting a smart music collection over the last 20 years now, or actually from Vivace, if you remember Vivace, of things that don't exist. They're not in the catalog. Now, I'm not trying to violate any copyright laws or anything. They're just for the students only to practice with. It's not meant for performance, obviously, but it's interesting how you can put students in there and they'll fixate on that. And so I've found that if I'm training musical aspects, you know, rubato, tenuto, dynamic things, when they're using Sibelius or Finale, which is horribly cumbersome, it doesn't want to do it, they realize, oh, I have to crescendo more. Well, yes, you do. Make it obvious. Let me hear it. So that's something funny for a passive computer. You get a bigger bang for your buck with them with the flute in the hand. So I don't know if anyone else found that to be the case. It's interesting.
Here's my PSA. Laurel Swindon is watching and sent a chat. I confirmed the date. I knew that Smart Music was offering free subscriptions, but it's through free access through June the 30th, 2020. So that's the Smart Music PSA. Free till June 20th. So.
Right, and if you download the classic version, because there's the online version that uses the JavaScript, or if you download the Classic, you can import your own custom files if you choose to make them like that. So that's what I encourage my students to do if they're going to do that. But we actually go through Digital Performer, create all the minutiae of tempo changes and things that they want. Then they save that as a MIDI, go into Finale, then convert it into SMP. It's kind of a workaround, but they get their custom version. Then if they want to decrease the tempo, then it's all very arithmetic, and it's, as far as kinesiology, it just kind of builds in those habits over and over and over again. But then they realize, oh, I don't like that retardando. I think it's too much. Well, go back and change it. Why don't you? That's things that we would think, well, in real time you do it, but it's funny. But if it's something that's really concrete, it's something on a screen or on a keyboard, it seems to mean more. It's really interesting, I think, as far as learning styles.
So could a student use smart music for their recital, or their, in this time where they can't be doing it with another person unless it's their spouse or something who they're and they have a piano at home or whatever, but could they use that for a jury, or can they record that? I'm not that familiar with it because we had Diane Fraser here for a while, so we were very spoiled at LSU, so I didn't use that so much.
We would allow it this semester. Right now, the juries, it's an upload, and it is not required to have accompaniment, even if the piece requires it. Some students opted to change to unaccompanied pieces, but in this case, we would accept smart music.
So can I come in there a minute? So can I ask a question? So smart music is like a sort of sophisticated version of music -1, is it? What we used to have very early on.
Right, it uses the IRCOM signal processing algorithm from the late 80s. They sold that to a company called the Vace, and it was a big, huge machine. I remember the first time, I ever saw it. It was at the UIL All-State Solo Ensemble Contest, and they wheeled in this big machine, had this big cartridge like the old Ataris, and it would play whatever that was. But it was meant to follow based on notes. You had to play the right notes at the right spot, otherwise it couldn't follow you. So it was interesting.
So
but now it's on your...
It's response rule, then, is it?
It does. You can set the level of how much it responds. It's the follow setting, in essence. It can be kind of gross, obviously. But, I've never used it for students for production. I think I remember doing a class once, maybe in the SEC school, maybe years ago, trying to demonstrate it, but I forgot my foot pedal, and I think I'd used my elbow to get the space bar. But it's not really great for real-time performance. If you use DAWs like Ableton or things like that, they actually are meant for real-time performance that actually is very rich. It's scary, actually, how rich it can be in some ways with those sorts of things. But I'm not saying it's a new normal, but it is something that at least my students, they kind of gravitate to. They find it very interesting with those sorts of things.
So I wanted to say something, add something to something Susan Milan said earlier about when we were talking about teaching through Zoom and the sound issues and everything. When we first started doing this online teaching, one of my colleagues, my bassoon colleague, was saying, oh, I'm going to make all my students, upload recordings and everything. And like Susan, I reacted like, oh, no, that's not the way I teach. I like to, it's really the interactive thing, and it's so important. And but then I started running into some of these sound issues. But then I was talking to another colleague, my saxophone colleague, Griff Campbell, and he was saying that he tried this business with the students recording the pieces that they wanted to play for their lessons. And maybe unlike Leonard, he didn't say to them, oh, don't do it multiple times or really try to, but he told me, he said that he was amazed at when they got the recording, it's like the students they'd listened back to themselves, and they'd heard a lot of things, and they'd corrected themselves. And he said, and so when I heard these recordings, he said, I didn't have anything to say to those kids. He said so they'd really learned how to teach themselves. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, I think it's good to do both, but I think that I've just started. This morning, I had a disaster because I'd asked them to do it just with an MP3, and she sent me Dropbox, and it didn't work. And suddenly, I was hearing my Spanish lessons were coming through the computer, and I couldn't get it turned off. It was I had to get my husband down here to help me because I'm such an idiot with technology. But anyway. But you know, when I finally could listen to her recordings, I mean, they were just beautiful. So
I think that's a really good point, actually, Penny, because I always say to my students, if you record yourself, you'll learn a lot about your playing. And it's very true. Of course, it depends to some degree how good the recordings are, because the sound is often so poor that it's quite depressing. I mean, I hate listening to my own recordings, frankly, and I used to hate going in the recording box and listening, because it's never the way you think you sound, because you've got your bone conduction and it all sounds different in your head anyway. And I think some students find that a little bit difficult, because the sound quality, they don't really know how they're sounding. But
Right.
Well, Susan, I like your recordings.
Oh, well, Chandos did a great job. It was Chandos sound, which was really famous in those days. And I think it's where they put the mics, you know, they knew how to do that in those days.
Right. Well, I do think, you know, the interesting thing, I've had my students sometimes do the same thing, record etudes before their lesson, so that they get the habit of playing them multiple times. So this has been actually not too much of a hiccup. They've been sort of used to that. But the one thing that I've always really focused on is that, you know, students that, yeah, you don't hear what your sound is really in real time. So we'd always put the headphones on or have the phone. You can actually use GarageBands. There's lots of little filters and things. You can set the mic, the phone about 10 feet away or 5 feet away and really kind of get an idea of what the sound is. So that old recording reality check can, you know, it can be, I think it's a necessity now. It's something that is so real time and so important for all of that. So, yeah, actually, the Nomad play. Someone mentioned this in the chat about that. The one thing I was talking to Susan about this over the weekend. If you use like a DAW, I have a very nice Flemish grand harpsichord patch that actually has the plectra sound. It has everything. It's amazing. And so my students, when they play their French Baroque music, they put in their and then I said, well, I want you to actually put in some ornaments in the right hand. Do something. That really, how do I do that? And the one thing is that they rhythmically have to write out the ornaments, which has made their ornamentation so much better. They've decided, oh, I have to start with a long appoggiatura, and then as I go into the battement, it's got to be a little bit faster and that. So it's really fascinating. Again, some of these things that you can demonstrate until you're blue in the face in the studio over and over again, and they still sort of don't get it. But sometimes when it's black and white on the page, they say, "Oh, it's a fascinating thing." But yeah, you can. The great thing about using those DAWs is it's their tempo. They can make the tempo that they want to. You know, with it. I often tell them just record what they would play. Then they drag their recording into the DAW, and then they can either use an algorithm that actually will help figure out what the tempos are, where the beats are. It's called a beat detector. Or they can put it in themselves, and then they move it around there. And I say, well, I wouldn't go that slow. No, that's you know. Or it got really fast, or you got really slow. Yes, I understand that, but you know you have to practice that. It's interesting, these reality sorts of things. So I guess, and I know I've kind of turned off the outline. Not that it was the greatest thing in the world. I mean, we talked about where you take, you know, if we're doing asynchronous teaching, having them upload the recordings and whatever that content might be. I think the interesting thing right now is collaboration. What can the students do collaboratively? And actually, right before I started this this webinar, I was on my students' masterclass, and we were actually going through. We have an interesting little project that I'm going to share on the screen here. And this is we all know this old donjon, this salon etude. And the one thing that is interesting, I'm just using my iPad, and in real time, I do this when I'm teaching the lessons. I can actually notate on the page. I can do it here, and then it'll show up on there. So you can do little notations and things, but we're going to make a music video out of this. They're going to, you know, of what this alludes to. So we're talking about, that's where it says lontano, sepiatone, fly in, you know, these, of what in the world this is. And, you know, it's a great opportunity to kind of take, you know, when you teach imagery in performance, how can you manifest it? I mean, I know my studio, we make little music videos with our flute choir pieces and things like that. They're online, but it's interesting to kind of show, you know, in a different vein what these students, you know, that showcase a different amount of creativity. And who knows, maybe they don't end up performers, and then maybe they become music producers or something like that. But for me, it was just a really concrete way of talking about what is the emotion you're trying to accomplish in this piece. You know, what do you come across? And it's made me kind of, just by having to do it in real time, figuring out a workaround to do it. And I was just using OneNote. If you wanted to know what that app was, I'll share it again just so you can see it. It's a Microsoft OneNote, and it has all these lessons. This is literally a student's lesson plan right here. And because I do it it just helps me keep track of it, but I can notate anything on the piece of music, or if we watch listen to the recording afterward, you know, I'll make little notes of it's too fast, too slow, there's a wrong note, what have you. So it's a quick little workaround if you use the Microsoft suite for it. But and I think that the tools are really interesting that we can all use throughout this. So in our last 7 minutes here, I kind of like thinking of, you know, what is the future? I mean, I know we were chatting before the broadcast start, you know, our institutions they're looking very closely whether, you know, when do we restart? How are we going to do it? Are we going to bring certain elements on campus? I know our discussions have been what buildings, and we have a very high cost like any Southern school does with air conditioning over the summertime. I mean, fortunately, we have a building that's classified as a laboratory because we've got so many millions of dollars worth of pianos and organs and things that you just can't turn off the AC. I mean, it would be a huge tragic loss of capital. But I mean, what are the sorts of things that we see? I know, Susan, you're starting your term going into it, but you know,
yes.
How do we capitalize on this? Those flute teachers that are watching right now, I mean, how do we all kind of capitalize and keep, you know, the efficacy of what we're doing, but then also the veracity of what we're doing? I mean, because that discussion will come. I mean, I'm sure Rhonda's works daily to ensure that everyone is still working. So.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions is, you know, this technology, which we're now all getting used to because of this very terrible situation globally with the virus. I mean, how much of that are we going to carry through to our teaching in the future, and the students as well? I mean, there are many good things might come out of it. Personally, I think students often rely too much already on, how can I put it, on outside influences like YouTube, listening to many recordings, basically not learning from the page, all those sorts of things. They are, as we all know, very fond of their iPhones and their computers. And this can only compound that in a way, because it must be like Christmas for these kids with all this technology. And I personally will look forward to getting back to, I mean, I'm very old school, don't forget, I'm ancient and I'm a dinosaur here, and I was brought up in a completely different generation and taught in a completely different way. And I'd like to get back to some of those values and away from the technology. I am looking forward to that, much as I must say this challenge is quite exciting, and it's great to be able to see all of you here, so that's a plus. And we'll do this again, and it is lovely to be able to connect with so many people around the world. That is a great plus, but I do hope that we don't get to rely on this technology for teaching, because I don't think anything surpasses one-to-one teaching, personally.
Right.
Being able to respond to a student, because it's almost as if, you know, there's a sort of telepathic thing that goes on between you and the student. It's like doctor-patient, isn't it? It's very personal, and it should be personal. It's important that it's personal, that you mentor them, and that requires, you know, contact and one-to-one teaching. So I hope we do get back to that, and maybe use some of this fantastic technology. Like Brian's obviously an absolute star at this and a champion of all these technologies. I'm way behind you, Brian. And and some of them will be very useful, I'm sure, but nothing, as far as I feel, will replace good, solid one-to-one teaching. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yes, I think we all hope to get back to that.
Yeah.
And I think that, and even during this time of remote teaching, I think it's important to ask the students how they're doing. And, you know, and I mean, some of it is just, you know, because a lot of them may be very depressed. It's hard to, you know,
It is very, very hard.
a difficult time.
It is, it's terribly hard. And I think that's going to be our biggest task, really, our biggest challenge, to motivate them. And it's not just motivation, it's inspiration as well. And I think they should learn to receive more inspiration by listening. And I think this is a very important thing, and they've got the time to do it, because they don't. I know most students don't listen to many musicians, and I don't mean flute players. They don't listen to music enough.
Right.
And decide it, and therefore be able to, I don't know, channel it into their own playing. They need that inspiration. Maybe they can have the time to do that now.
Right.
I think what I've learned from this is the importance of teamwork, because you know, we've had many more faculty meetings, and it's very important for each of us in the School of Music to know what other people are doing. For instance, you know, finding out that, well, the ensembles are not playing, but they're being recorded to record their parts and send it in. And so all this stuff adds up. So it's so important for all the faculty to collaborate, you know, in this way. And I think that'll be a permanent improvement, you know, in how we deliver things, is the collaboration that has been necessary in this environment.
I entirely agree. We've had in the flute faculty at the Royal Northern in particular, but also all the other two conservatories, we're all pooling our sort of ideas all the time, and discussing our classes and how we're going to keep the students on track. I'm already putting together my timetable for next term with my video teaching and my classes. Yeah. So the classes, we have classes every week at all the conservatories, but particularly the Royal Northern, and they're all being scheduled. So presumably they'll be scheduled as we are now via video, which I think it'll work very well.
So Rhonda, from your perspective as an administrator, since we're, you know, efficacy and measurement and standards and those sorts of things, I mean, what kind of advice can you offer to all of us as far as, you know, ensuring that we're really doing our job and showing that?
It's tough. From listening to students who contact me daily, it's important that we're assessing, the measurements need to measure the content of what we're delivering. And we can't change in the midstream what we're trying to get students to learn. And so there's been a lot of sharing of best practices. And I think as we all go through this, we're learning how to deliver content, how to make it meaningful and relevant for students. And time will tell whether, you know, we're efficient and actually doing what we say we're doing. It's, you know, the student evaluations are one measurement of our teaching, but who knows how the remote aspect of this is going to affect that evaluation system. I've encouraged a lot of my faculty to ask another person to sit in on lessons, just to observe and give feedback. It's a different world.
Whatever happens, we're going to have a lot of recorded data, aren't we, of what we're doing? Something maybe we didn't have before, right? Well, Diane, I mean, anything, I mean, especially we're in tornado season. I'm sorry to say.
Sadly, we are. Our students have the option. The university made the decision that any classes can be pass-fail. There are some restricted courses and some disciplines not in music. So the students have up until the last day of classes, which is for us April 24th, they could even designate a class just pass, not even on a grade, because of these ideas of how do we assess. It's assessment and accountability from both sides, accountability from the students, but accountability from our standpoint that we are, as Rhonda says, we are delivering what we say we will deliver. and it can be difficult in this way. But I do know Zoom, I've certainly learned a lot. We laughed that the students can do pass fail, but we're still evaluated on a 1 to 5 scale. I asked my associate dean, could we just do pass fail? Because my first Zoom meeting synchronously for a studio class, and my first Zoom studio class was, I've learned a lot, let's just say. I think I've evolved greatly and will continue to do so. But we've all learned a lot in the process. And some of us just had a short amount of time. The university said, we have this technology, use it. We got good guidance from our School of Music administrators, fortunately. But then we moved on. I'm curious to see people like Susan as they move through 6 more weeks, 8 more weeks on down the line to see what has evolved since then. But yeah, it does. I did include my students do some recorded technique work and excerpts or etudes, and then we do a live lesson as well on some additional repertoire. But we use UA box for storage, and each person has their own folder to avoid any kind of FERPA issue, any privacy issue, and they all have a copy of a basic rubric for what we're looking for and listening to. It's the same thing Leonard said, though. We have to make sure they don't get completely obsessive. And one said, I can't stop recording. I can't stop. And I just said, send it in. You just pretend you walked in your lesson. It's similar things. It can never end, Leonard, or we can stop it and go forward. But yeah, I know we're running out of time, but it seems we have much more to discuss, maybe in future episodes.
Well, I did want to, before maybe chatting about that and asking each of you, but I mean, Penny, any final thoughts, for yourself and the experience?
Yeah, I think this is a real learning time, and I'm going to be, having a meeting with the other faculty members in my area tomorrow, actually, and with our not our dean, our whatever it is, our director of the School of Music, and we'll be talking about all this stuff. And because I feel very much like this is, this is a learning experience for all of us, the students and we ourselves, and I think it's really great. I was just looking at the chat that's been going on while we've been talking, and somebody, Eduardo Martinez, shared Nomad Play. Is it a French app? Are you familiar with that? Which provides accompaniment through an actual recording of a professional accompanist, pianist, harpsichord, or harpist, where the solo line can be muted and the feel is more natural than something like Smart. So, I mean, I'm learning new things just even looking at the chat that's going by, and it's so great to see all of you and to hear what you're doing. I've been taking notes about a lot of the things that you guys are doing. We can learn from each other through all this.
All right. Well, this is recorded. I'm going to upload it to my YouTube channel, and everyone can have it via Facebook and so on and so forth. Susan and I were chatting earlier about there's really an interesting unknown fact, and it's very timely because people don't know, but Victrola sales took off in 1919 and 1920, right after the Spanish flu epidemic. That recording, the sort of, we could call it canned music, whatever it is, music was disseminated even further than it was before. So I think in some ways we have to embrace whatever this next stage might be, hopefully never getting rid of that real-time interaction performance, that in some ways that athletic event, watching someone up on the platform perform and hearing and smelling everything that they're doing. I mean, that's really the heart of what we're trying to do. But I think it's embracing at least as best we can the training, helping everyone develop as musicians. So I really appreciate everyone's input and your sage advice and experience, because I know this is really invaluable. I know there are quite a few people out who are attending, and if you're game, maybe for another, maybe serialize our little discussion here, make it during a coffee time, but we could chat about other times that might work for that. I really appreciate, Susan, you being willing to, in this later GMT time for you, and for everyone else, thanks so much. I got a little note from Mary Karen. There was a travel issue that had happened, so it just got caught, not being able to get back to her Zoom, and that's the issues that we kind of all face. So I'm glad she got out. I try to make it a point, and I think I tell my students this every day: get outside, so we don't face that. What was that book you told me about again this earlier, Susan? About the people who live
when the machine stopped, the enforcer. Yeah.
Right. So we don't want to be the Morlocks.
We mustn't be imprisoned by the machines. No. And I think music will always be live. I was saying to Brian earlier that when in the 70s and 80s, we used to have stickers in England which said "Keep music live," and so even then there was this fear that recordings, and there was LPs in those days, it wasn't even cassettes and CDs, that it was going to take over and no one was going to go to live concerts. But people do, and they still do, and I'm sure they still will in the future. And this technology we're learning now, well, it's unfolded, isn't it? And it's a very interesting time. It's a terrible time in some respects, but I'm sure good will come out of it from our point of view, from learning all these new skills. Certainly, I'm learning new skills, which is great. I'm enjoying that. And so I wish you all well, and it's been really great to be on this webinar. We've got new vocabulary, haven't we?
That's right. Well, thank you again to everyone, and I hope that everyone who's out there watching really enjoys it. And if you have questions, please send them to any of us. I know that we're all in this together, and it is with the dream and hope that we're going to be back real-time live, working, training the next generations of musicians who are going to take up the mantle. So thank you so very much, all of you. Thanks for joining me and the University of Arizona, the NFA Library in this webinar, and hopefully we can do this again. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you for inviting us, Brian. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Be healthy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.